Welcome back to part 2 of our descent in the iceberg of the world's most disturbing albums. Don't forget to check out the previous video in case you haven't just yet. Let's pick up right where we left off. Level 4, Bent and Bootlegged. This tier features openly dark albums that are loved by fans but considered difficult listens rooted in genres that don't appeal to the mainstream and are often acquired tastes for most. Rise of the Common Woodpile is the third album by Carolina Rainbow Open Wound Chorale, a purely experimental folk record featuring what the band is mostly known for, creaking instrumentation and frog vocals with dissonant, jarring banjos and off-kilter beats. A lot of the songs are 1800s covers given an avant-garde twist, with hellish accordions building off of normal song structures in disturbing white noise and buzzing. Songs are bent, high-pitched, and borderline listenable for most, with weird clunking instruments peeking in creating a deranged prairie atmosphere. Through Silver and Blood is the fifth New Roses album and their most popular, marking a new level of darkness in their experimentation, with notably slow, distorted, and heavy influences. Perhaps the mood of the record was deliberately influenced by the difficult circumstances surrounding its recording, with vocalist and guitarist Scott Kelly being homeless and struggling with addiction, and guitarist Steve Von Till also experiencing turmoil at the time. The album includes a number of lengthy epic tracks with ritualistic instrumentation, tribal drumming, and moments of rapture, choirs of screaming, and a surprising set of acoustic instruments behind them. It was largely seen as a spiritual successor to Black Sabbath's self-titled album, with roaring, powerful groans complementing mammoth blood-curdling riffs and tormented, distorted bass of the instrumentation. Converge's fourth album, Jane Doe, was the first to feature the band's definite lineup, which has since become one of the most important releases of the metalcore subgenre. The band's new addition, in particular drummer Ben Kohler and new songwriter and bassist Nate Newton, were instrumental in the experimentation of the record, which was mostly inspired by Converge playing tracks originally conceived by vocalist Jacob Bannon's side project Super Machiner. The band intended on creating an abrasive and divisive hardcore record, inspired by a dissolving relationship and its emotional fallouts. The record was made in 2 studios, the larger one intended for slower tracks which required more ambiance, and the smaller one for the faster tempos. The resulting sound is a suffocating, oppressive sludge of relentless musical cacophony, every song becoming a violent collision of speed, screaming, dissonance, and chaos. Metal Machine Music is the sonically controversial fifth solo album of Lou Reed, which featured no discernible songs and instead favored an experimental collection of compositions of modulated feedback and other effects mixed at varying speed. Lou Reed, who was famous for being in the Velvet Underground, claimed that he had invented heavy metal and that he had intended to conclude the genre with this record. The album was panned by critics, with the discordant sustained notes and loud amplification disliked by most of the time, with even a Rolling Stone review comparing it to the tubular groaning of a galactic refrigerator. Despite this, it has received better reviews in recent years, with music lovers recognizing its importance in the no-wave, industrial, noise, and harsh noise scenes to come in the future. The Wall of Sacrifice was the fifth Death in June LP, and by then the band was essentially a one-man project by Douglas Pierce, although a number of musicians collaborated on this. Originally, the band had only produced 666 copies of the record's martial minimalistic drumming and keyboard effects with atmospheric neo-folk soundscapes mixed with vocal fragments and spoken word pieces. The record is characterized by hypnotic droning and sound collage experiments, with either expensive and atmospheric hints or concise and melodic structures with spectral voices and sonic territories that mix Dadaism and electronic manipulation, as well as old German singing in the 16-minute-long title track. Crazy Clown Time is the second David Lynch studio album, which we didn't expect to be named anything else, described by him as a collection of dark songs in the style of modern blues with trademark elements of avant-garde, feedback, noise, and dissonant soundscapes with dense layers of texture. Like his movies, Lynch incorporates a twist on the 50s influence, in this case the guitar with an addition of tremolo, reverb, and delay. Lynch's vocals are also treated through vocoders and modulation. Lyrics, which were written by Lynch, are, as expected, enigmatic stream of consciousness style, with spoken word interludes that emerged out of jam sessions with sound engineer Dean Hurley. Karen O from the Yeah Yeah Yeahs contributes a guest vocal performance on the opening track. The Big Problem Does Not Equal the Solution equals Let It Be is the first album by eccentric actor Crispin Glover, of Back to the Future fame. According to legend, ex-Devo frontman Mark Mothersbaugh took Crispin to a party one fateful night where he met Barnes and Barnes, mainstays of the Dr. Demento show with their song Fishheads, who wanted to do a record with him. The result is a bizarre David Lynch-esque affair filled with freak polka spoken word pieces. Barnes and Barnes wanted to get a potential hits on the album, which might explain the inclusion of the 3 cover tunes, including a fitting rendition of a Charles Manson song and Nancy Sinatra's These Boots. His 4 original songs range from a psychotic rhyme about a clown to a warped rap about masturbation. The liner notes state that if you can discover what the big problem is, then you can call 213-464-5053 to tell Glover what you think it is. Listeners would then receive postcards as a response for their tips, but as of 2007, the line has since been disconnected. Public Frustration is a Good Idea is the first live album by Swans, recorded during their early years as a no-wave band, during the Greed and Holly Money tour of 1986. This is the closest any of us will now go to experience an old-school Swans gig, which went beyond noise and into some sort of cataclysmatic abyss of pain, cynicism, and emotional entropy. The production was lo-fi, but it was needed to give a sense of just how loud these concerts were, with their trademark miserable, self-loathing misanthropy, punishment, spite, and nihilism translated into something resembling music. Rough, scratchy, screamed vocals complement the thick, heavy noise beats that, in the midst of an intense experience, contribute to a dark, grotesque, skulking, stinking, maimed, depressing, and obscene atmosphere. Deceit was the second and final studio album of This Heat, a more song-oriented collection assembled from improvised recordings accumulated since 1976, with varying degrees of audio quality, like its predecessor, This Heat. The music included new improvisations along with songs that the band had been playing during live performances, making for some very unconventional sounds. Sometimes it would sound like the machinery was breaking up, as though the record player was exploding, an experimental, confrontational, and politically charged take on post-punk music, and musique concrète mayhem. The record was inspired by the fear and angst the band members felt at the possibility of dying under the threat of nuclear warfare, and addresses missiles with endearing names. Much of this radiation-soaked masterpiece was recorded at Cold Storage, a disused refrigerated storeroom at a former meat pie factory. Digilog was the 20th album by the British avant-garde band Soviet France, filled with dissonant industrial textures and dark ambient. This was the first album that the band recorded using digital techniques as well as analog, which alienated several fans who felt the group sold out when they made the switch, because the decay of the analog recordings, a key aspect of their warped sounds, was finite and corruptible, and digital corruption wasn't appealing or as interesting to listen to. This record represents 2 worlds colliding and melting into one another, a mixture of failing analog and high-end digital equipment, with a heavier emphasis on industrial thumping beats, low bass rumbles, weaving in and out of beeps, creating a record that is the embodiment of sound as dirty and clumsy as anything else we perceive with our senses. As of today, it's the only Soviet France release in circulation worldwide. Oh, and beware of the last 5 seconds. What sounds like a nuclear explosion may just rip your heart in two with fright. DOA, the third and final report, is the second Throbbing Gristle album, a stylistically varied, distinct collection of tracks ranging from captured conversations to thoroughly composed creations, with a mixture of studio and live recordings and collaborations, as each member provided a solo track as well. The band was collapsing under the strain of their personal relationships at the time, not helped by the demise of guitarist Cosi Fanny Tootie's relationship with vocalist and leader Porridge and her affair with synth player Chris Carter. This led Porridge to become more paranoid, taking on most of the band's ferocious lyrics, which discussed murder, mutilation, and genocide, and the desperation of his newfound loneliness. I Shall Die Here is the 4th album by The Body and produced by the Haxan Cloak, communicating a horrific plunge into darkness of pure sonic terror. Plodding, scream-infested bass lines meet stark electronic textures and rhythms with monstrous guitars. Thick, heavy, and bleak bursts of guitar distortion combined with the occasional vocal screams. Dark and nightmarish sounds mixed with drone metal, incoherent screaming, and some really heavy drums and bass. This is one of those albums that just takes you in an entirely different world. You can hear him screaming and rambling in the rooms above you. The electronic production greatly augments The Body's aesthetic and sound. Ghastly screams drowning beneath the murky layers of agonizing noise, jarring distortion, plodding martial snares, and eerie atmospheres. The debut studio album by American heavy metal band Body Count was produced by Ice-T, a rapper, who co-wrote the album songs which deal with political issues, police brutality, with lead guitarist Ernie C, and performed as the band's lead singer, although the album itself does not feature rapping. The controversial song Cop Killer was the subject of much criticism from various political figures of the time, and Ice-T eventually chose to remove the song from the album. Body Count was intended to reflect straight anger. It was supposed to be the voice of the angry brother without answers. Ernie C and Ice-T were inspired by the dark, ominous tone and satanic lyrical themes of Black Sabbath, but based their lyrics in reality to be scarier. Initial copies of the album were shipped out in black body bags, and local police had told the management of a retail store in Greensboro, North Carolina, that they would no longer respond to any emergency calls at the store if they continued to sell the album. Winter, an alias of Tobias Mako, plays all the instruments and tends to alternate between live and program drums in Paysage d'Hiver. He recorded his first 6 albums over an undisclosed period of time, and then released them all over a much shorter period of time. He wanted his work, his initial progression as an artist, to be untouched by public perception. The extremely lo-fi, raw production style tends to alternate between and even combine black metal and ambient music. It incorporates elements of drone and dungeon synth as well. Production emphasizes the atmosphere as the most important aspect. All instruments, including otherworldly keyboards, are soaked with incredible amounts of distortion, so it's hard to tell the difference between them. Drums and guitars melt and create one massive drone full of trembling trebles, where what truly matters is the sound and the fury, signifying impending doom. When the Kite String Pops is Acid Bath's debut album and one of the only 2 albums they ever released, now an underground classic. The album's artwork is a self-portrait made by notorious serial killer John Wayne Gacy while in prison awaiting execution, and it's even signed by him. Plays a big part on the record, as well as the nihilistic urges brought about by it. Songwriting is vulgar and gruesome. Dax Riggs' vocal performances consisting mostly of guttural, painful yells, and a back and forth of different styles. Riffs are chunky enough to combine doom, sludge, stoner, grunge, and death metal influences all together. The band themselves have described their sound as death rock and gothic hardcore. Like others on this list, some of the album samples Blue Velvet and A Clockwork Orange. First Recordings 1973 is saxophonist John Zorn's second album, featuring recordings that he made while still a student between 1973 and 1974, but not released until 1995. Zorn calls his collection the craziest stuff he's ever done, an oddball mixture of noise, radios, saxophone, and distortion. Pursuing a direction in musique concrète, the bulk of the material here seems to be concerned with pure and immediate sounds. He would record performances made surrounded by toy percussion, glasses, pots and pans, a cassette player, turntables, TV sets, vacuum cleaners, and his soprano saxophone, resulting in a total cacophony of spitting artificial farts, random yelling, tinkering, tinkling, bellowing, the shrieks of anguished chimpanzees, paper being folded and scrambled, music, and a random TV in the background. Revolutionary Pekingese Opera was the 3rd album by the band Ground Zero, which was formed and inspired by John Zorn, mixing free jazz, improvisation, and experimental noise all together. The album is a sound collage piece combining noise music and samples a resampling of an avant-garde jazz performance of a Chinese opera called Consume Red, on which the performers improvise around a short sample of Hojuk music played by the Korean holy musician Kim Seok Chul, and featuring operatic singing, saxophone freakouts, and more. The band plays heavy rock instruments over it, with occasional chaotic moments of pure noise. Level 5. Degenerate demos. This tier features even darker concept albums that seek to alienate their listeners with inaccessible complex sounds. Black metal lamentations and depressive ambient abound. European is the second and by many considered to be the heaviest of all Asylum albums, the project of German musician Pedro Engel, who became an underground icon in the world of agrotech. It features aggressive hardcore EDM beats and harsh distorted vocals that, despite holding on to melodic structure, offer skull-crushing intensity and abrasion. With titles like the ones flashing on screen, it's not hard to notice why some of these releases remain novelties, save for those who dare to stomach their harsh, confrontational intensity. Joy Shapes is the 5th album of the avant-garde musical group made up of former husband and wife Tom and Christina Carter. It is a neo-folk effort with a creepy atmosphere and extended dreamlike improvisation for 75 minutes of only 5 tracks, featuring high-pitched psychedelic droning, letting loose with moans moans and whispers. Songs unwind with a gradual, near-violent climax of howling feedback, doubled by voices disconnected from their bodies. This album doesn't welcome you in, but it does defy you to listen with eeriness and dissonance. Heresy is the second Universe Zero album by the rock and opposition band, featuring the heavy use of dissonance and dark, brooding, and extremely complex melodies. The release features a sticker carrying a warning, the most sinister album ever recorded. It sounds more like classical chamber music than rock, with dark, foreboding, misanthropic strings and reeds, and gets quite close to the proto-industrial and gothic genres. The atmosphere is oppressive, with nervous, jabbing ostinato patterns and rich instrumentation, which include oboes, bassoons, and string instruments. The Place Where the Black Stars Hang is the fourth Lustword album, which we have met while he collaborated with Robert Rich and Stalker in our previous video. The album consists of a 75-minute title track that is broken up into 5 movements, a sonic absence of light. Minimalistically changing synthesizer waveforms backed by subsonic heartbeat and breathing rhythms are the hallmark of the album. Thick swooshes sound like some entity breathing heavily down our neck, swallowing us in sinister undertones and vast open spaces at the empty vacuum of the dark, bottomless, infinite abyss. Through this record, we embark on a journey to what exists outside of our universe, the sounds that exist at the bottom of the subatomic world. I Have a Special Plan for This World is a long-form single by the English band Current 93, and despite being a single, it is too experimental not to warrant a mention. It marked a return to the band's experimental roots, which by then had been abandoned, using unconventional techniques like drone synths, custom-made instruments, and even a modified speak-and-spell child computer. It is named after a poem by a horror and weird fiction writer, which is recited by band member David Tibet, who was nicknamed by Genesis Porridge, yes, that Genesis Porridge of Throbbing Gristle. The story is about the world being nothing but an illusion without a clear narrative, but part of the appeal is its lack of clarity. Is he a supernatural being or simply an insane man whose plan is a massacre? As the unsteady ambience breathes in and out, the narrator encounters various people and thoughts, each experience leaving him with muddled wisdom. The sound is marked by disembodied cut-up voices, occasional blips, and Tibet's surprisingly restrained, almost monotone delivery. And after a devastating 22 minutes, the music dies, slowed and glitching. Homotopy to Marie is the 5th official Nurse with Wound album, but the first real Nurse with Wound album according to leader Steven Stapleton, because it was made without the intervention of the original trio lineup. It was recorded every Friday from 6 to midnight at London's IPS studios for a year. It is less musically conventional than its predecessors, relying on tape editing, construction, and classical avant-garde techniques combined with resonating gong tones and disembodied children's voices. Its terrifying musique concrète obtuseness is a mysterious surrealist nightmare consisting of various tool parts, people speaking, people sobbing, water drops, noise, percussion, toys, and other miscellaneous sounds that belong in horror movies as opposed to albums. The laughter heard on the track The Tumultuous Upsurge of Lasting Hatred is sampled from the King Crimson song Easy Money from the album Lark's Tongues in Aspic, which I may or may not have tattooed on my wrist from how much I love it. Girl with Basket of Fruit is the 11th and most recent Zuzu album, co-produced by member Angela Seo and indie rock band Deerhoof's drummer Greg Saunier. It features thematic nods to rituals, mythology, and mundane and divergent beliefs, as well as films and music, many of which are references to previous Zuzu albums, imbued with the agitation, tension, sorrow, and anger the band is known for. The title is a reference to Caravaggio's painting Boy with a Basket of Fruit, but the gender was swapped in order to emphasize the ominousness of female martyrdom, referencing SA and femininity, the most common topics throughout the record. Lyrics were taken largely from the internal effects of internal events in the band's history, reactions to and explorations of other people's texts and images, a culmination of several different sounds that the band has implemented over the years. Noisy textures burst from left to right, strange vocal overlays that give way to frequent complete freakouts, and some of the most wild lyrical content the band has put out thus far makes this release cryptic and unabashedly disturbing. Norwegian for If the Light Takes Us, Hyviselig Setter Oss is the third Burzum album. It was recorded alongside the previous 3 releases between 1992 and 1993, with its actual release spread out throughout that period. During this time, Burzum frontman Vikernes befriended Euronymous, the guitarist of fellow black metal band Mayhem, and stabbed him during a fight, which we discussed in our Shock Musicians Iceberg video. This album came out while Vikernes was in prison, and it is a concept album about what existed before the beginning of the world, a kind of nothingness in which Vikernes calls others to seek the darkness and hell to find nothing but evolution. Vikernes' shrieks detail about how miserable and angry he was at the world in general. It is made up of 3 epic black metal drones of sheer unmitigated depression, plus a closing dark electronic ambient piece. Despite, or potentially because of, Vikernes' deranged state, this album, to many, is a perfect expression of every negative emotion imaginable. Darkthrone's Fenris was one of the people Hvisli Satar Os was dedicated to, and his own album, which came out during the same time Transylvanian Hunger, also happens to be on our list, which Vikernes wrote lyrics for. It was the band's 4th studio album, but the first to be recorded with just 2 members, Fenris performing all instrumentation and Nocturno Culto providing vocals. It was recorded on a 4-track recorder set up in Fenris' bedroom, dubbed Studios by the band. The band's anti-Semitic remarks on the sleeve caused controversy, which they went on to apologize for on the following album, with Fenris condemning his behavior as going through a phase of being angry at several races. The ending of one of the tracks can be heard saying, "In the name of God, let the churches burn," backwards, as a reference to the Norwegian church burnings. Unlock the Shrine is the debut album of extreme metal band The Ruins of Beverast, and multi-instrumentalist Alexander von Malenwald, who also plays in Naglfar. It builds the atmosphere of a slow-burn psychotic journey through compositional skill, slow somber passages, low-pitched whisper-like vocals, and occasional samples. The entirety of the album is made up of these interchanges between the slow and fast riffs, with primitive rhythms, spoken passages, and gloomy processional explorations prompting violent black metal tantrums. And it will take you places. Not necessarily places you would want to go. Subliminal Genocide is the 5th album of American one-man black metal act Disaster, who also goes by Malefic, real name Scott Connor. He was inspired by astral projection, darkness, suicide, hate and death, choosing to express himself through despair and verging away from the Satanism other metal bands were inspired by. The album is a reflection of the utter indifference of the world, oppressively doomy and experimental, numbing, and yielding an anesthetic haze delving into the heart of the grotesque. The record has a lo-fi underproduced edge that gives Disaster's music its characteristic repetitive, eerie, and despondent sound. Connor was featured in One Man Metal, a 2012 noisy documentary, and moved on from black metal in 2010, switching his focus to neo-folk projects. Dictus Tenecara is the 2nd album by Bethlehem, Latin for It is the only album with vocalist Rainer Landfermann's vocals, which were described as some of the sickest and most extreme, and sometimes over the top, a straight-faced, blood-curdling performance that is difficult to forget. Lyrics are surreal and nonsensical, but the imagery isn't random. Sparse notes create a feeling of desolation, black metal riffs making way for slow, atmospheric doom that is disturbing, scary, and painful. The music is stripped down to an eerie, almost ethereal bassline before kicking things back to chaos in wild, aggressive spurts. But by the 1998 follow-up, Landfermann had been replaced by Marco Caron as vocalist. Hatred for Mankind is the debut album by mysterious English band Dragged into Sunlight, made up of 4 anonymous balaclava wearers, known to play with their backs to the audience with minimal lighting and candles to set the mood. It features increasingly violent shifts between hostile death metal riffs like the various vocal and instrumental screeches and thicker, more venomous doom metal grooves. The album cover sets the tone, depicting Satanism, a deformed nude woman giving birth, and gravity-defying erection illustrated in one terrifying visual. The album also features a number of serial killer quotes, including some resident favorites like Eileen Wuornos and Charles Manson. Teetering guitar riffs oscillate between death and black metal, with suffocating thickness blurring a mix of sludge, death, black, and doom metal that sounds insanely evil. Another fully anonymous band is Portal, who perform in executioner suits and utilize stage names for album credits, concerts, and interviews. Their debut album, Sepia, called for a vocalist, known as the Curator, to wear a tattered wizard hat. It features distorted guitar riffs, down-tuned rhythms, and vocals ranging from menacing and echoing sound effects to death grunts. The band has commented that they explored depth and atmosphere in the aim of a descriptive soundscape where the feeling must flow, exploring different planes of darkness and atmosphere and not being extreme for the pure sake of it. Their lo-fi production approach involves striking a balance to allow the instruments to spill forth and explode when necessary to accentuate the impact of the music and enhance its soundscapes. The massive guitars create the gritty sound, playing fast and predictable choppy riffs that forge the band's own breed of coarse, gritty, and evil death metal. Caligula is the third album by Kristen Hayter, whose stage name Lingua Ignota translates into unknown language in English. It is the first to be recorded in a professional studio featuring collabs from other musicians and guest appearances, including Lee Buford of The Body. It is named after the hedonistic sadist Roman Emperor Caligula, as a concept of a psychotic fugue Kristen was going through. It deals with Hayter's own experience its lyrics, those present in politics as well as Hayter's own madness as a result of trauma. The album combines elements of classical music with opera, metal, and noise, creating a large and powerful sound. On one track, Hayter reworked Jim Jones's tape complete with screams and panic. She also uses her striking voice, the sound of rambunctious lament akin to a wolf's ululation, to proclaim her impending revenge and abuse, keeping her larynx low to restrict her more feminine timbre, and often using her worst vocal take on the final track. Also released on Profound Lore Records was Prurien's fifth album, Frozen Niagara Falls, the project of Dominic Furno. Originally, it was planned to be recorded exclusively using non-musical acoustic sounds, like things being destroyed, rocks being cracked in half, and hurled around the highest of volumes. To channel the spirit of homelessness, Furno recorded the album in New York City despite conceiving its concept in power electronics haven, Italy. Rushing static, distant growls, and harsh noises are featured prominently as the dominant sounds of the album that transcend most common genre conventions, be they power electronics, harsh noise, or even metal. Venereology is harsh noise pioneer Merzbau's second album, his take on death metal after having been signed on a death metal label, Release Entertainment. The release brought American fame and audience to Merzbau, who had been previously only widely known in the Japanese harsh noise circles. Perhaps then it isn't a coincidence that it was named after the branch of medicine that studies STDs. According to legend, the track I Lead You Towards Glorious Times is the loudest track to ever be recorded on CD format. Merzbau was more inspired by the concept of death itself than the musical limits of the death metal genre, wanting to move beyond sonic rules of music and citing Taboo photographer J.P. Whitkin as an influence. He recorded the album while drunk on beer, and after its release returned to a more traditional, sobered, harsh noise sound. Mommy and Daddy is the 15th White House album. Steve Albini, of Big Black fame, who had also helped produce Spiderland, contributed to the production of a track on the record called Private, while controversial artist Peter Sodas was responsible for writing the majority of the music, along with permanent band member William Bennett. Even Bennett himself recognizes this offering as possibly the darkest in White House's career, with an explicit thematic focus on domestic abuse. There is a neurosis present on the music that he found genuinely shocking and did not think of himself as capable of discovering, fearing that fans of the band's original work would have disliked it also. It was then natural that it could have only been Sodos and Albini to put together a track as depraved as Private, which compiled recordings and interviews with victims of violence in CA, in what would have become Sodos' terrifying signature style. Xandra Metcalf's Project Uboa's fourth album, The Origin of My Depression, reflects on her struggles with transgender identity and mental health. She associates the sparse instrumentation with bare and quiet interludes to signify her deep sadness, with only few and far between harsh noise interludes for a jarring contrast of all sorts. A lot of the songs were improvisations refined into compositions, usually after several attempts, while some were happy accidents. Blunt, bleak vocals are produced so as to mimic the transition she had experienced through sound, shifting from male to female and back again within a single track, and using the title track to actually list all the origins of her depression. As it builds in cacophony and intensity, we reach the climax, crashing walls of noise becoming a darker and more oppressive look into someone's journey with coming to terms with an intimate part of themselves. Level 6. This file is corrupted. This tier features albums that can only lead one to wonder, why did anyone make this? Listener discretion is advised, and mysterious lore is plenty. Behold Total Rejection is the fifth album by chaotic black death metal band Revenge. While many describe this release as war metal, the band refutes the label, emphasizing heavy barbaric chaos with violence and long songs that implement complex song structures with a brutal wall of sound. Lyrics explore various militant themes of anti-religion, anti-humanity, and the collapse of mankind, but the vocals of the record are perhaps its most contentious and controversial aspect. Descriptions range from pitch-shifted and hellish to a frog gargling melted cheese, who swear blasting this album is the perfect way to alienate friends, family, and any soul in the vicinity. The Conet Project, Recordings of Shortwave Number Stations, is a series of recordings of number stations, which are geographical markers to unknown locations. Conspiracy theories believe them to be operated by government agencies to communicate with spies. The decision to release the set was based on the work of number station aficionado Akin Fernandez, and the collection was available for free download along with a PDF transcript in 1997. The title comes from the mishearing of the Czech word konek, which marks the end of the transmission on the Czech number station. Faint female vocals, static silence, monotonous tones, and childlike melodies characterize the collection. It went on to be featured and sampled by a number of artists, from Porcupine Tree, who we saw in our previous video, to Wilco, who was sued for copyright infringement as a result. In 2013, the collection was re-released with an additional disc added, which includes exclusively recordings of noise stations. Its terror emerging not from overt horrifying imagery, but the idea of finding something unintentionally lurking underneath the surface, deep into reality. Darknet Portfolio is the project that follows the mixtape by the enigmatic group of rappers releasing as World Corp Enterprises. The story behind the record is detailed by both Nexport and Mudahar from Some Ordinary Gamers and other videos, but essentially this is the companion audio-only piece to a series of visual vaporwave-inspired surreal videos that were released by World Corp on YouTube, which then led to a website tied to what is believed to be a secret organization or an insanely intricate ARG. The production is lo-fi with palatable vintage beats and what appears to be steady flowing rhythms. To many, the music can be rather innocent and unassuming, and if taken by itself, rather belongs in the upper tiers of our iceberg, if at all. But everything changes once you get to the interlude. Some dismiss it as an edgy sample, but it's hard not to find the screaming and lyrical content downright terrifying. A parody of an advertisement that offers anything you can possibly think of, no matter how depraved. After the interlude, bars become more depressive, Venetian Snares, who we've briefly met on our previous iceberg, teamed up with experimental industrial breakcore artist Hecate to produce Ninfa Matriarch in 2003. Literally. The couple got together and consummated their relationship, opting to record the end result and remix it into a full-length album. The hard-hitting beats were constructed from the sounds of flesh slapping, moaning, shouting, and musique concrète-like interjections of dirty talk. Recording sessions were creative. Despite the concept, however, the album itself is melodic and surprisingly listenable, giving, as Pitchfork writer Alexandra Laura Lindhart said, a whole new meaning to the term drill and bass. If the legends behind Stalag and Gulag have led many to question the legitimacy of their recordings, Diagnose Lebensgefahr is the real deal. This project's sole member is Natram, who had previously released black metal music as Silencer in the famous Death Pierce Me album, where he gained notoriety for his high-pitched shrieking, allegedly exacerbated by self-harm while recording. This album, however, sees him radically shift direction as Transformalin. It is a bleak voyage into dark ambient, power electronics, martial and noise-influenced industrial sounds, and a jarring experience that can be harshly rhythmic only to dive into unmetered, dragging ambience and a real study into madness. Natram, who resided in a mental hospital at the time, samples doctors talking, paralyzing whines, and screaming along with controlled, clean vocals, serving as a kind of narrative. All that is known to this day about Natram is that he is from Sweden, that he was born between 1975 and 1977, and while he is anonymous, he did write a book in 2011 entitled Pig's Heart, containing his photographs and poetry. Bish Bosh is Scott Walker's 14th and last album, and also his longest in what was a 50-year-long career of the former 60s pop idol and member of the Walker Brothers, turned avant-garde experimentalist. Walker, who didn't write for pleasure and took several years to compose his albums, actually set aside time to create Bish Bosh and recorded it within 2 years due to a series of booking problems and the death of one of his producer's father. The record sees Walker playing with language a lot more than in previous releases, from the name of the album to the complex and oftentimes mysteriously and unsettlingly humorous delivery of the dramatic lyrics and concepts in it. Walker's longest song to date, the 21-minute long SDSS 14 plus 13B Zircon, a flagpole sitter, sees him performing as Zircon, Hun ruler Attila's court jester, only for him to become a dwarf star and burning out. It follows another jarring and experimental release by Walker, The Drift, but it becomes even louder, weirder, and more reckless, dissonant, asymmetric, and defiant than ever, daring to challenge even Walker's most devoted fans who were used to his off-kilter sound. Walker went on to release one more album, a collaboration with drone metal act Sun, before passing away in 2019. The Litanies of Satan is the debut album of avant-garde musician and artist Diamanda Galas, whose straining voice is capable of the most unnerving of vocal terrors. The experimental a cappella release is made up of 2 longer pieces, The Litanies of Satan and Wild Women with Steak Knives. The text for the first track was taken from French poet Charles Baudelaire's Les Fleurs du Mal, devoting itself to the emeraldine perversity of the life struggle in hell. The second track is a cold examination of monomania, the devoration instinct, for which the naive notion of filial mercy will only cock a vestigial grin. Some only hear gimmicky grotesque screams and gabbles, while others consider the experience to be a cathartic exorcism, and easily one of the most unsettling experiences of sonic, relentless hostility. Frederick Hoffmeyer's project Puce Mary's 6th album, The Drought, knits music concrete, haunted spoken word, and distorted synths into a sonic journey through infernal realms of a dystopian future, with long drones and scarce beats. Harsh screeching drones and minimal mechanical rhythms keep pounding throughout the album. Ambient industrial sounds abound, with noise injections that pierce through your skull like a knife, and spooky spoken word sections that disrupt any semblance of melody. Hopeless anguished noises lay behind deranged generations of a woman who sounds like she lost everything she could lose, especially her mind, like a real horror movie. The same year The Drought was released, Hoffmeyer would co-produce a song in up-and-coming psychedelic soul musicians Eve Toomer's album Safe in the Hands of Love, gaining significant notoriety for his ominous, addicting sounds. Ramley was one of the OG bands in the power electronic scene of the industrial music of the early 1980s. By then, made up of Gary Mundy and what was a 14-year-old Philip Best, who was already involved with Whitehouse at the time. Despite them disbanding in 1984, Mundy's record label Broken Flag continued releasing their music, including 1987's Hole in the Heart until years later. Like many of their earlier releases, this one veers towards a power electronics and harsh noise style, stirring controversy because of its nods for shock value, which Mundy has since disavowed. Buried synth textures, nevertheless, steer the album in a more detailed and complex direction, with wordless, distorted chanting and a remarkable sense of structure and space, which separates it from harsher contemporaries. It's fascinating and frightening, with a dark atmosphere that remains impossible to shake. Paranoia is one of the later releases of Marco Corbelli, better known as Atrex Morgue, who we've met in our previous Shock Artists Music Iceberg. Paranoia was Atrex Morgue's potentially biggest release, the only one out in the old Europa Cafe label, and it describes his slow death with great sorrow. Marco's sick vocals are akin to those of a psychopath who is ready to kill, with self-abusing power electronics mixed with a dangerous feedback-inducing collection of noises. He manages to infuse death, obsession, and darkness into every recording, sounding like the most perverse and nightmarish Italian mystery giallo soundtrack of all time. Spectrum Ripper was the 29th Masana album, the work of Japanese noise musician Maso Yamazaki, featuring an extreme collage sound of insane vocals. The name of the act is a combination of the Japanese words maso, meaning masochist, and ana, meaning woman, as well as a pun on the name of pop singer Madonna. Screams and feedback create a unique palette that some equate almost to a with a structure that throws down one layer for an even interval and then another slightly askew. Brutal frequencies and rabid screaming vocals mix to create textured sounds for some of the most brutal, abrasive, and ear-shattering noise records of the 90s. Mazo also dabbles in psychedelic music using analog synthesizers and has since started releasing music as Controlled Death as of 2018. Dorita's fifth album, Seawolf Leviathan, is an excruciating dissection into one of the most sonically dense explorations in the world of harsh noise walls. Seawolf Leviathan is made up of two 30-minute long tracks that defy listeners into an ear-bleeding array of doom. Because of its lack of distinct shifts and noises, the album is indeed very polarizing, either loved by musical aficionados who find an interesting pleasure out of appreciating the calming repetition of thick noise, or absolutely loathed by those who find it abrasive and even boring. The only way to find out where you stand is to give it a listen. With a band name and album as blatant as this one, it wouldn't make sense for this outfit to go anywhere else but this tier on this list. Make a Change was a dark debut that cuts through ears like 1,000 razor blades at a mind-blowingly slow tempo that emphasizes despair and hopelessness, with the vocals matching the pace. The soul-crushing balanced by hints of dark ambient, which make the release feel even more dense and sparse, a repetitive downward spiral into complete hopelessness with surprisingly softer moments. The album is made up of 4 songs, divided into chapters, which are each longer than 13 minutes, with a whopping 27-minute long closer that only emphasizes the slow overtaking of deep depression. What more can be said about Buyer's Market? We talked about Peter Sotos in our previous video, who worked alongside Steve Albini as the compiler of what most consider to be the most upsetting and unsettling album of all time. The entirety of the record is made up of snippets and samples of audio interviews with SA and CSA family members or the victims themselves. There are many reasons, beyond the obvious subject matter, that make Buyer's Market as a concept truly terrifying. Consuming it in one sitting, through all its hour-long runtime, could be akin to watching a news segment to some, but that negates the openly artistic endeavor of the album, which does intend to shock and absolutely dishearten listeners. An open confrontation with some of the most harrowing material recorded on tape, which most people don't willingly want to subject themselves to. Not to mention the process itself, which I can't help but wonder, how much more of this was out there then? And what about now? What qualified these particular clips and samples? Was it impact? Is there more? What was discarded? Does it get even worse? Perhaps just those thoughts are scarier than Buyer's Market itself. A Roko's basilisk of music existentialism. Don't Google it. Pseudoscorpion is the mysterious singular output of a once 4chan poster whose name has since been banned by the site itself, Senjin. Those who were able to hear it confirmed that it isn't an album, but rather a collection of audio recordings that focus exclusively on the harrowing attempts to essay young girls. Any trace of the album has been scrubbed clear on the surface web, with many left to speculate on whether this was real, whether this was made by Zenjin himself, or if it was just a publicity stunt for Deep Web CP. The full story has been broken down in a detailed video by Plagued Moth, which discusses the potential theories behind the horror of Pseudoscorpion. For now, I will stick to the music, and I hope you don't mind. Thank you so much for watching. We hope you will subscribe for more content coming soon. I cannot thank you all enough for following Sets in the CD on our journey, which I assure you has just begun. Excuse me while I refrain from speaking for the next 30 years, but I promise we'll see you soon for more stories behind the music.